We now move on to an interesting language construct called the case statement. Cast your mind back to the if, elif, elif statement, and I'll mention, and I'm sure you believe this is true, that when you use the if statement, quite often what you're actually doing is something similar to the following. You've got one variable and you're testing it against a series of values. Perhaps value 1, value 2, value 3, value 4, and you're doing a different piece of code for each one. In this example here, we're testing var1 equal to value 1, and if that happens to be true, then we run the code for case 1, and then the code for case 2, and so on. Now there's a lot of coding going on here. We're writing out the if statement a lot of times. We're using test quite a lot. We're using the word then and elif quite a lot. And the equal sign, of course, in test is all being quite repeated quite often. Well, there is actually a nicer way of doing it. Nicer in the sense that it looks more aesthetically pleasing and more easy to understand on the screen. It still does essentially the same thing, but there's less work involved for the shell. And this is, of course, called the case statement, and it looks like this. We take our variable that we wish to compare to a bunch of values, and we put it in between the words case and in. And then for each of the different values that we want to compare it to, we put them on a line by themselves, and we put a round bracket after each option that we're comparing to. Then we put the code for that particular option. That might be several lines of code, that might be 100 lines of code, or it might be 0 lines of code. It doesn't really matter. But we put the code, whatever code that we want to run, if the variable happened to match that value, and then we put 2 semicolons next to each other. That is the case statement's way of saying this particular case or this particular option is now over and we're ready to look at the next option. You can actually put those 2 semicolons on the end of the previous line if you want to, which is actually nice to do if there is only one line for each case. One line of code, one option for each case. But if there are several lines, you tend to put the 2 semicolons on a line by themselves. Finally, when you've exhausted all the options, you put ESAC, which is case spelled backwards, just like phi if spelled backwards. So let's see an example of the case statement in action. Here's a little script called case test, and as you can see, we ask for a rock group name to be entered. We read in the name, and then we compare that name with 3 different values. Those 3 values can have spaces in them, as you can see with the second example, dire straits. And for each case, we determine another variable called no albums, or number of albums, and another variable called last album. And finally, after we've determined the number of albums and the name of the last album, we echo out that information to the screen. So it's a pretty simple script, but hopefully it demonstrates how to use the case statement. Let's test to see if it runs. We'll run that now, and please enter a rock group name. How about the Beatles, like that. The Beatles made 12 albums. The last one was called Let It Be. Okay, fair enough. And I'm sure you understand that it would work exactly the same for the other 2 choices. Now, what if we ran that again and we entered something that wasn't there, like Fatboy Slim, for example? Fatboy Slim just made albums. Didn't say how many albums. The last one was called, and it doesn't say that either. Okay, so clearly our script doesn't work very well if the user decides to enter a value that we didn't allow for. So with that in mind, let's move on and have a look at a little extension to the case statement that you can use to cater for such things. So this is somewhat similar to the else clause of the if statement. When you want to have a piece of code that is run if the value of the variable that you're matching doesn't match any of the above cases. In that circumstance, you simply create a case called asterisk or star. It looks like this. You can see we've got a little case called star there. It's exactly as we had before, except that will get run, the code in that case will get run if the value of var1 did not match any of the above cases. Let's go and have a look at that example working in our little sample script. Now in this case, I've created a little case called star, and I simply, in that case, echo out the words unknown rock group and exit the program at that point, because really I don't want the echo on the last line of the screen to be done if there was an unknown rock group. So let's test that in action now. And so we'll enter the old Fatboy Slim again, and it's an unknown rock group. Okay, and that is exactly what we wanted to have happen. So I'll now just quickly show you a couple of other simple options that can be used with the case statement that just make it that little bit more user-friendly and useful. And the first one is that it's actually possible to specify that the same code be executed in several different cases, and you might do that like that. You use the vertical bar symbol or the pipe symbol. So here, where I've got code for cases 1 to 3, that actual code there will get executed if var1 happens to be equal to val1, val2, or val3. So I could adjust my little rock group sample script as follows. Instead of just allowing for Beatles, I could allow for the Beatles as well, in case someone decided to type it in like that. And let's test that. And we'll type in the Beatles, and the Beatles made 12 albums, blah blah blah. Excellent. Also, it's possible to use wildcard characters to match values to variables. As follows, we can say here D star, which means, of course, anything that starts with a D, just as it does with file names. So we can use the asterisk character, we can use the question mark character, we can even use the square brackets characters, just as we use with file name wildcards. So I'll just give you a little simple example. Suppose that I wanted to make sure that they could enter uppercase or lowercase b for the Beatles. Then what I could do is I could simply change that to a B or a capital B, like that, just as we do with file names. And then I save that and run it, and if I enter Beatles like that, then that actually matches as well. So it will match uppercase or lowercase b in this case. So it's in fact, I really could just do it like that. If it just happens to begin with the word beat, then I'm going to assume that it's the Beatles. Now that might be actually incorrect, but it's certainly a valid thing to do in a shell script. So I'll just test that. Beat, I could even put the beatniks, I suppose, and that probably is incorrect. I very much doubt there was a rock group called the Beatniks that made 12 albums, but at least it proves the feasibility of that particular option in the shell script. So that's pretty much it for the case statement. Here's just a few notes just to keep in mind while you're using it. It's actually a rather complicated piece of code, the case statement, because there's a bunch of new language elements that we haven't seen before that we have to remember and get right, including the word case, the word in, the word ESAC, the round bracket, the double semicolons, the vertical bar symbol, and all the wildcard stuff. I mean, that's all quite complex, and it's all new with the case statement. It's actually a lot less complicated to use an if statement, but it's considerably more code. If you can get the actual typing right, if you can get the syntax right, the case is a lot prettier to use. But like I said, there's a lot of memory work involved. You've got to remember all these different elements of it. So keep that in mind, and it's actually what most programmers use instead of a series of if, elif, else clauses. Second note, you might have noticed during the entire module that I've just shown you that the case statement really doesn't have anything to do with the true or false notion that we created earlier in the chapter, or the notion of exit statuses. It really just compares one variable to a series of values. Okay, keep that in mind, and you're probably going to be fine with the case statement, which brings us actually to the end of this chapter on conditional code. You now know quite a variety of ways that you can cause code to be executed conditionally. Let's move on, and I'll set you some exercises to do for those constructs.